Hello everybody, and welcome to this video looking at open world games as a genre, or as an approach to game development, if you will. I wanted to do this video because I've been playing through a couple of noteworthy open world games in the recent weeks, one of which is The Sinking City, which is a Lovecraftian style horror game by Frogwares, and the other is Judgment, which is the latest in the Yakuza series by Sega. And I guess it's a little bit hard to get away from open world games these days. They tend to be in everything, and just about every major game seems to be trying to implement open world elements, which is what I wanted to do this video about, because I don't think that the open world necessarily works for every game. And I think that it is an overused genre and approach to game development, and I think that it actually works to the detriment of a lot of games that would otherwise be quite good or enjoyable. And yeah, I wanted to have a look at some of the reasons that I think that open world isn't necessarily the best approach for every game and every game developer. So it's only been the last couple of years that we've seen a lot of open world games developed, and that is because the technical requirements of them is quite significant. You need to have the big open world to explore. It needs to be persistent. It needs to be open, hence the moniker. And that's not necessarily easy to do. It's not easy to do on a programming from a programming point of view, and it's not easy to do from a technical point of view. You need a fairly powerful console to be able to run a proper open world. So we saw them really start to emerge through the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era, but it's only really this generation that we've seen them overtake other genres like the first-person shooter as kind of the default way of approaching a game that aspires to be kind of major or blockbuster in tone. And I think that developers have got to the point where they do the open world idea quite well. They know basically how to structure open worlds. They have obviously got an awful lot of learning there from the early pioneers like Rockstar and Ubisoft with GTA and Assassin's Creed and all of that. So the learning is there about how to construct an open world. And I think that while there's always going to be bugs in open world games, just because of their scale means it's very hard to squash them all, I think that for the most part open worlds are fairly bug-free experiences now. What I think is the problem is that I don't think developers necessarily approach these games understanding what it does to the rest of the game, the rest of the experience. And I think that in a lot of cases, like I said earlier, it's to the detriment of the quality of the game that it is put into an open world, it's kind of shoved into an open world structure. Speaking of the open world games that I've been playing at the moment, I think The Sinking City is a good example of a game that is really damaged by being open world, because it is inspired by Lovecraft and it is a horror experience. It needed to have that really closely crafted design approach, and it needed to have a very strong focus on atmosphere and storytelling in order to really convey what it was that people were playing this game for. They were playing it for the Lovecraftian elements. They weren't playing it for an open world experience. They were playing it because they wanted Lovecraft as such in a video game. And in order to do that horror atmosphere, in order to do that horror experience, and to really drive the chills through the player and all of that kind of thing, the developers needed to have a very strong anticipation of what the player was doing. They needed to be able to understand where the player would be at any point in time and what the player would do next. There needed to be that expectation that the player would follow a certain route through the game. And I think if you look at an earlier Lovecraftian game from last year, Call of Cthulhu, that one was a really good example of developers understanding what the player was doing at any point in time in their game, and then being able to craft the experience around that. It was a fairly linear experience. It never got too bogged down at any point in time. It really was good at pushing you through and making sure that you were on track at all the time. Whereas with The Sinking City, there's just so much downtime because you spend so much time wandering around town, not really doing anything. And there's combat in there, yes, but the combat is, again, it's too random, it's too disjointed, and the storytelling and the open world and all of those elements don't really come together. And that's because it's developed around that mission structure where you need to go to a point to get a mission to go to the next point. What happens between those points is the issue, and the developers don't really have any control over it because the player might be off doing something that they couldn't anticipate because it is open world and therefore freedom is important. But you can't craft an atmosphere, a tense atmosphere around that, because without the understanding of what the player might see and do, the developers can't create a scenario for it. So it either becomes very generic and it becomes very monotone, which is what happens with the Sinking City, or it just loses the atmosphere entirely. Now, I do think the Sinking City has atmosphere, but I don't think it's particularly well executed. I don't think it's a particularly strong example of the horror genre, and that is because it lacks focus. It lacks control from the developer. It lacks ideas. It lacks creativity. Not because the developers didn't try, but because the developers were really hamstrung by the experience, by the design approach that they took. I think this one would have been a lot better if it was linear.
Oh, a brave sailor.
And apologies if you hear me clearing my throat a bit. I do have a bit of a cold today. Unfortunately, it is winter here in Australia, and that is killing me a little bit. But to look on the other side of the coin, to example of a game that uses open world in a really meaningful way, and the game would not be the same without that open world, Judgment is a brilliant example of open worlds, and I think that we should point to Judgment as an example of how developers should approach open worlds. If they're going to do an open world game, they need something like this. Now, Judgment isn't a huge open world to explore. It's about 10 blocks or so. It's a very tiny section of a map to wander around, and everything, all the action happens within that small space, where most open world games try to create entire cities or entire states in some cases. Judgment really focuses things down on this very small space, and that's to the game's benefit, because all of a sudden the entire space feels alive at any point in time. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, there's something interesting happening and something going on, and something that you can participate in. There are so many mini games spread throughout the map, but they're always within a couple of paces of one another. There's always these side quests that you'll come across when you're just wandering around town, and the developers can anticipate that you're going to come across those because the world itself is smaller and more condensed. You can't really avoid a lot of the stuff in the game, because to do so there's just no path around. There's no alternative way of getting around town. So again, the developers can really anticipate the experience that you're going to have, and they can structure the game around that. And that's why you have this really brilliant idea through Judgment, where the main story itself is quite serious in tone and quite dramatic. But the side quests are where the game's humour comes through, and people love Yakuza and Judgment for its humour. And the developers knew that you're going to find those humorous scenarios precisely because, again, you can't really avoid them because they've kept the world condensed and they've controlled the experience within it. So I guess the challenge that developers face with open worlds is that question of control. How do you make sure that what your players are experiencing is something that you have designed? And it would seem that one of the answers is to make the space small, to keep it fairly condensed. As an open world, the more condensed it is, the more likely you are to run into the stuff that the developers want you to see, and the less likely you are to just skip by it. Another really great example of developers really condensing down the open world to make it something that they have some control over is the Dark Souls series and Bloodborne and Sekiro and Nioh, that kind of Souls genre, subgenre. They are always open in the sense that you do have a lot of freedom about how you go about the place, how you move from one place to the next. You can obviously choose which direction you want to go in most cases. But at the same time, they're confined in terms of the paths that you can take. So you'll have small, slightly open areas, but then you'll have one or two paths. And while those paths branch off in various directions and give you that element of control and the openness in the sense that it doesn't matter what you see, you can probably get there just by wandering over there. So there is that sense of open world there, but it is controlled. And because it is controlled, again, the developers are able to make sure that you see what they want you to see, make sure that you see it at the pace they want you to see it, and have a controlled experience, which again helps with the atmosphere, which helps with the dramatics, which helps with the gameplay. Everything is much better when there's a sense of following along with what the developers intended you to experience. On the other hand, examples of games, open worlds that are quite effective despite being quite large in scope and being largely uncontrolled by the developers, are The Witcher and Assassin's Creed. Those games work because they're not so much about the story itself, they're more about the experience of being in the world. And those developers, Ubisoft and CD Projekt Red, want you to have that grand open epic adventure where there is that sense that you're traveling across vast reaches of land, where there's that sense that culture actually transitions from one to the next as you go from place to place. And to do that, you need huge open worlds, really huge open worlds, which are breathtaking in scope, and they are just... Every area has that kind of distinct personality about it. So it's more about experiencing areas than it is following narratives or following developer intention. And that's very difficult to do. You need huge budgets to do that because, I mean, even Ubisoft has endless numbers of bugs in a lot of their Assassin's Creed games to start with, and they patch them out over time. But that is a very difficult thing to do because you need to be able to defocus players away from the detail of the adventure to instead experience the world itself. And I mean, when I play Assassin's Creed is a good example. I love my Assassin's Creed games. When I play them, it's more because I want to experience the history of them. I want to go to famous landmarks. I want to see amazing buildings. I want to follow along with kind of the broad events of the time. I'm not so interested in the character themselves, but rather what's happening within the world that character is in at that point in time. I'm there because I'm interested in the history as such rather than the narrative or the characters, because I think anybody who plays an Assassin's Creed game would tell you those things aren't particularly great. It's more about that history side of things that keeps people interested. And it's kind of the same with The Witcher. I mean, I do love The Witcher, but The Witcher's strengths are definitely in its sense of world and scale rather than the kind of moment-to-moment gameplay or characters. So those are good examples of good open world games done well. And it's hard. It's definitely hard, and I don't think that open world works for everybody or every development or every game. So hopefully we see a little bit more variety in terms of the games that are created over the next generation, especially in that big blockbuster space. Hopefully developers stop pushing to try and make everything open world. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do back me on Patreon if you enjoy my stuff, and we will be with you again shortly for the next video.